Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Otep, this is Femi here with Freedom Now. And your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen, and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about freedom now, within, in, freedom now, in.
Barigani. This is Sister Paige with Freedom Now's agenda for this Saturday, March 25th, 2023. Our solidarity with the United Teachers Los Angeles and SEIU 99 on striking this week against unfair labor practices, and that the fight locally and nationally to support education workers be forever strong, and its relevance, wisdom, and fight for our youth to never be diluted by gatekeeping media or by those chosen to interview who speak to preserve any level of the wrongs to save face. Power to the youth, power to education workers, power to the people. We commence today's program with our ancestor, Didan Kamati, and Sister Luyanda Kaboka bringing us our African drumbeat historical calendar. Then, we spend this Freedom Now hour discussing Black film and Pan-African history. This hour, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews filmmaker extraordinaire Billy Woodberry, faculty at California Institute of the Arts, better known as Cal Arts, in Valencia, and one of the leaders of the Los Angeles School for Black Filmmakers, here to discuss his work and films. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Pongo, Barry Flanagan, Donald Harrison, Lee Morgan, Earl Klug, and Roy Hargrove. So sit back, phone a friend, and as always we stand ready for revolution.
L'impérialisme, le colonialisme, le néocolonialisme, le sionisme, l'apartheid, Western, Ian Smith, Begin, vive la révolution, vive le président Sékou Touré, vive la révolution africaine.
Molweni Ekai. This is Sister Luyanda with the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar and commentaries for the week of March 29th, with commentary by Brother Didon. March 28th, 1890. The U.S. passes resettlement law to remove Native Americans from land east of the Mississippi River to further erode Native American presence in the U.S. The genocidal policies of white supremacy continue, and the infamous Trail of Tears begin, with thousands dying from the forced march.
Why does the United States Euro-liberal left movement deny the fact that the United States is a settler colony and posit the centrality of Native Americans, including Mexicans, as central to any solutions to the contradictions of the United States?
March 29th, 1923. The War Resistor League is founded, one of hundreds of anti-war, anti-draft popular people's organization dedicated to stopping the flow of human capital, human lives, enriching the capitalistic class in the U.S. imperialist wars and campaigns of genocide throughout the world.
In an article, New York Times, March 27, 2005, quote, "For military recruiters, a hard toll from a hard sell. For the first time in nearly 5 years, the Army missed its active duty recruitment goals in February. The reserves missed its monthly quota since October. Let us get organized and smash the draft campaign now rather than react after they institute the draft."
March 30th, 1960. The African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, South Africa. Two major anti-colonial movements banned and over 2,000 cadre arrested. This is a result of national strike stay-at-home campaigns where the apartheid government declares a state of emergency.
The Second Tribunal on Death and Destruction in Africa, Madrid, Spain, March 2005. In Didon's presentation, with the outlawing of apartheid, we got Nelson Mandela, and the Europeans got the land, diamond, gold mines, and all of the wealth of South Africa.
March 31st, 1910. Florence Motomelo was born. She was a leading anti-apartheid resistance leader, banned in 1962, arrested in 1964, and died in prison due to horrible neglect. She was a teacher and a mother of 9 children, 4 of which died in infancy.
African women's role, politically and sociologically, is not only critical, but primary for revolutionary change and struggle as their being the first educators of the nation. The mothers, as well as possessing the most fundamental driving force of all societies, procreation and recreation of a species. We must free up the revolutionary potential of our women from male chauvinistic practices and attitudes within the movement. Slave of a slave.
April 1st, 1967. Formation of the California Black Panther Party for Self-Defense and Liberation of African Peoples, which spread throughout the U.S.
The destruction of the Black Panther Party was primarily due to 5 major ideological changes within a 5-year period, from revolutionary black nationalism to Marxist-Leninism to Mao Zedong thought to Trotskyism into communalism to the Democratic Partyism. The external forces of the FBI and COINTEL manipulated these internal contradictions to murder and frame up its leading cadre. As an oppressed people, our central problem is one of ideology.
April 2nd, 1980. Africans in Brixton, England rise up in urban rebellions against racism.
The worldwide European capitalist oppression of African people globally and historically, and conversely, our resistance can be demonstrated from Australia to India, from Brazil to Nigeria. This is the reason why a highly disciplined global Pan-African party and corresponding mass movement is the only solution to our global oppression.
April 3rd, 1919. The British massacre over 400 and wound over 1,200 at Amritsar, India.
India, the home of the largest national population of black people in the world, is founded on the racist caste system of Hinduism, which permanently places the untouchables, the scheduled caste, in a state of perpetual bondage. Only when African people think globally and react globally can we free up our brothers and sisters in India from this 1,000-year-old caste system.
April 4th, 1968. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated while trying to organize workers in Memphis, Tennessee.
Dr. King's advancing ideological position on the war in Vietnam and on organizing workers into militant trade unions pose a non-resolvable contradiction with the foundation of U.S. capitalism. Within 24 hours of his assassination, over 120 cities in the United States, as well as cities with Africans in England, France, Germany, and the colonized microstates in Africa, rose in mass urban rebellions, heralding a new era of black power an expansion of tactics from solely nonviolence and integration to one of freedom by any means necessary.
April 3rd, 1948, Luisa Amanda Espinosa was born. She was one of the first members of the FSLN, Sandinista National Liberation Front. She protected safe houses for underground comrades and weapons. She was the first FSLN woman to die in the battle at the age of 21.
Imperialism divides and conquer strategy has driven a wedge between younger militants and seasoned militants. Our task must be to destroy this so-called generation gap and link the historical struggles of the elders with the ongoing struggles that our youth are waging today. United we stand.
April 4th, 1988, Angola, SWAPO, and Cuba defeat the racist government of South Africa and the U.S., CIA and UNITA-backed armies at Quinto Carnaval.
The tri-party unity of Africans from Angola, Namibia, and Cuba were able to stop and defeat the most powerful military force in Africa, the European-dominated South African Defense Force, and its backer, the most powerful military in the world, the United States of America. This is one example of many of how Pan-African unity can bury European imperialism.
This has been African Drum Beat Historical Calendar for Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara, and streaming worldwide on kpfk.org. And in the language of our freedom fighters in South Africa, we want to end with Amandla
Awethu,
Amandla
Awethu,
Amandla
Awethu.
Okay, this is Spoon Jackson from Solano State Prison, and I wanted to put out on the line that me and my art partner Sarah Marie Bartorio are looking for sponsors for our Rabbits of Realness booklets and Instagram. And if you go to the Instagram of Rabbits of Realness, you'll see what we are about, and we are hoping for that and for interns to help with the project and to help with the website. So if anyone is open to that, to being mentored by poets and artists and painters and other people, I would appreciate it if you would contact me. And another thing, I just want to let people know that I got kicked out of Shakespeare because, I don't know, this overzealous, power-hungry person, and she does not know what Shakespeare is, and she wasn't even a part of Shakespeare. She was way back in the back of the gym. She come up to me and told me that I wasn't participating in the rehearsals, which was wrong because the director from the streets who does know Shakespeare has shock on her face, and all the other participants in Shakespeare had shock on their face. So when I went back the next week, this person, Lamel, had took me out of Shakespeare. And so now I've been taken out of the radio program here at Solano. I've been taken out of the creative writing class here at Solano, and now I've been taken out of Shakespeare. So I'm just letting people know that if they want to write to anybody here at a warden or something and ask them why I am being denied participation into the arts in Solano State Prison, please feel free to do that, because it would be appreciated. But on the other side, I'm going to continue to create. I'm going to continue to write poetry. I'm going to continue to do Shakespeare. And I do private Shakespeare over the phone to people who want to hear me do Shakespeare. I'm even trying to learn how to sing so that I can sing. Anyway, thanks for your time. And please check out the Rabbits of Realness. And Ani DeFranco got hers just going up today on the Rabbits of Realness website, Instagram. And check it out. Ani DeFranco, friend of mine. Thanks for your time.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org. And with me on the line is Billy Woodberry, a member of the faculty at California School of the Arts in Valencia. and filmmaker extraordinaire. His best-known film, Bless Their Little Hearts, is a gripping and evocative depiction of the Black working class in South Los Angeles, honored at the Berlin Film Festival and selected in 2013 by the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. for the prestigious National Film Registry. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Billy Woodberry.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
And thank you for accepting. So how did you get into filmmaking?
I got into it because what happened was I was doing a course in Latin American studies, and this was in the early 70s. And I took a course. It was actually a history course. It was about contemporary history of Cuba. And in that class, the professor showed a number of documentary films from the Cuban cinema. And I found them extraordinary, that films that were about they were about important but subjects, but not in the normal way. And that what happened was they followed a group of young people who were part of a literacy campaign to teach the people in the countryside, former peasants, how to teach them how to read and write. And it was a big mobilization, and these young people would go, leave their homes in the cities or the towns, and they would go into the countryside, and they would teach sometimes elderly people who had never had the chance to go to school. They would teach them to read and write. And I found this films exciting and interesting, and also it convinced me that film could, maybe unlike I had perceived before, it could be a way of participating in the political and social life, and it could be a way of then sharing that with an audience to hopefully stimulate sort of critical thinking and participation of those people who were inclined and wanted to do something. It seemed that film was a way that you could communicate with them, and also one could justify one's existence in political movements by saying you can make a contribution. It's the same, I learned then that there's a whole history of this in the arts and that kind of thing. But at the time I was not thinking, I hadn't thought it through. And then with that, I decided to do a master's in Latin American studies, and it was an exciting time because it was a time of the new Latin American cinema. And it was coming from the countries of South America. And there was a historian named Burns at UCLA who taught Latin American history. And he came up with this idea of teaching history through films because he was encouraged by the kinds of films that they were making in Latin America that dealt with political and historical subjects and that kind of thing. And it was a way to inspire and attract people that were interested in the subject in another way, rather than simply signing text and lecturing and that kind of thing. And he was excited about that. So with that, I learned about the films, and I started to. Then after I was interested, I started to see as many films as I could, and the ones that attracted me most were the ones from Brazil and Cuba and Africa, because it was also, we got to see the films of Ousmane Sembène and the new cinema that was coming out of Africa. So I started to read, think about it. One of my best friends, he was a Marxist thinker and activist. And I was in a reading group with him and this thing. So when he learned I was interested in film, he said, "Oh, but you must know Jean-Luc Godard." "No, I don't know Jean-Luc Godard." "Well, you should know Jean-Luc Godard." And so then I started to try to learn about this. And I found learning about these films, seeing the films, learning about the filmmakers, learning about the history of cinema and that kind of thing, I found it really exciting to discover before school even, the Soviet cinema of the 20s, after the revolution and all the things that were done there and the excitement about them, and this kind of thing. That kind of inspired me. Then you learn, you start to learn about you learn something about history. I started to learn about the history of the neo-realists in Italy after the Second World War. And they made really wonderful and exciting films, and sometimes with non-actors, sometimes in real locations, houses, apartments, fields, in the countryside, whatever. And they prove that you, in fact, didn't necessarily need all of the equipment and conditions of the studio, and you didn't need all of the apparatus or one could work without the existence of stars and this kind of thing. So I found all that inspiring. And in 1973, I applied to the UCLA's School of Film and Television, and I was admitted to it. And then once I was there, I had to learn to make stuff. I had to learn to make things. And the film school was a good place. It was an exciting place. We had a lot of different and interesting students from many countries in the world: Iran, Egypt, South America, some African students from Middle East, from Iran we had. And with that, and also we had a large contingent of Black students, African students, and Black students. And this made it a kind of community and a place where one found some encouragement. And also you weren't so lonely. And then they sort of, people who were there before me, they had sort of set a kind of standard. And they had the idea that films, whatever films we made or whatever we did at that time in school, should somehow be of use and relevance to people who weren't in school, but the people who came from the kind of communities that we might have come from, or our families had come from. So that I found very helpful. It was also, it gave you the advantage of having support for learning the process, for learning the technology, for learning the things that you need to learn beyond, and it gave you a support beyond the curriculum and simply what the faculty was giving. It was a great place to be because it's a public school, which allowed many people from working class and from different parts of the country in Los Angeles to be able to study film in that way. And it was the expansion of these opportunities. It came about in maybe the late 60s, early 1970s, due to the efforts of students who were there in the school and who wanted to expand opportunities. And also it came after 1965, and the period when the leading institutions and people in charge of the institutions and the society supposed that it might be a good idea if, in fact, they expanded the opportunities, that's sort of the environment and context. And So I was fortunate to be in school at that time with my colleagues, with those people who were in school. Also, students, because of their consciousness had been expanded or raised because of the Vietnam War, and the fact that many of us faced the possibility of the draft to end up in the war in Vietnam and in Indochina more generally. This gave us a kind of focus, and it forced us to think about the choices we made and what we were doing and why we were doing it, and generally in the society after the Civil Rights Movement, the development of the Black Power movement, the development of all the other social movements, of the time, right? That provided some context. But also, if we weren't in favor of the Vietnam War, we were curious to know what was Vietnam, where was this place, and that was available in some films that were made at that time. And a lot of the colleagues in the school, they were more radical and non-conventional in their thinking, and they were interested in those subjects too. I'm thinking of a colleague we had who was from Greece, and in fact he hadn't done his military service, right? But we knew something, and we could learn something about the dictatorship in Greece because of the movie Z, huh? Even if, so things like that. It was the context. It was a time of the African liberation movements, African Solidarity Day, and in Central America, and also, so that was the politics, that was the context. I don't know if that answers. I hope it's okay. I hope it's helpful.
It was more than okay. And we're speaking with filmmaker extraordinaire Billy Woodberry. His best-known film is Bless Their Little Hearts. But you've also been a documentary filmmaker. For example, you did a film about the poet Bob Kaufman. Who was he, and what inspired you to work on a documentary about him?
I made that film because Bob Kaufman was a poet who was, at one point, he was the most well-known figure in North Beach. He was associated with the Beat Poets, and he was, in a way, what happened, he published 3 books in his lifetime. And he also had this thing of, he was a presence in North Beach, and he was a kind of fierce defender of the liberty of people to be in public places, to recite poetry, to be together, to, hang out, that kind of thing. And he was, and he was opposed to all efforts to sort of suppress this expression or free speech and that thing. And when I started the film, I had some idea that he had a backstory that was somehow interesting, because what happens by the 1970s, Bob Kaufman, in the early 60s, Bob Kaufman is really popular and famous and known and this kind of thing. And then in 1964, so he stopped being present. He stopped writing. They thought he stopped writing. He didn't stop writing. But he stopped some of the things that he was known for, being in all the coffee houses and these places and reciting poetry and, making different actions and this kind of thing. So it was like, what happened to him? And then his books, in fact, came out after he had stopped his participation in poetry at the time. And so people forgot about him. And in a way, for me, it was an interesting thing to understand something about the man, the poet, the poetry. I had to learn all of those things. But also it was the idea of where did this man come from and how did he become so accomplished in such a short period of time. So I started to look at his previous story, and I found that inspiring and illuminating, because it turned out Bob Kaufman, and when he was a young man, he had been a member of the Merchant Marines. He joined at 17. We know because his mother had to sign for him to be able to do that. And he was a sailor during the Second World War. He was a member of the National Maritime Union, which was one of the more formidable and radical trade union organizations at the time, and starting in the 1930s through the 1940s until it was broken by the McCarthy era and the Taft-Hartley and the reaction after the Second World War. And I learned about this story, and that gave me, because I was interested in the subject and I was interested in the period, it gave me even more encouragement and desire to make the film, because I was able to say something about this person. At the same time, I was able to tell a bit, maybe remind or share some important aspects of American history that are often unknown and not understood, because in a way that knowledge was marginalized and suppressed. So the film gave me a chance to talk about that. The other thing is, I wanted to know where he came from, how did he become himself, and this kind of thing. And part of the story is the story of his family and his origin in New Orleans. And he's born in 1925 in New Orleans, and he came from a family of 13 children. And so to learn that and to then try to understand, like, what was his itinerary, what did he do? And I learned all the places he was in, all that. And I learned, as a member of the National Maritime Union and a member of the Communist Party when he was a very young man, I learned something about his involvement with that, something about his character, something about what formed him, and then his transition from this kind of involvement in politics to kind of politics that was possible through poetry and through sharing his ideas, his vision and his view through poetry. So it's a continuation in a way. And it gave me the opportunity to meet a lot of intelligent people, smart people, who had different aspects of the understanding of this history and all these things, and to get them to help me share and tell something about Bob Kaufman. Poets, scholars, historians, writers, thinkers of different sorts. And that's how and why I made it.
And now we will go to a station break.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is our sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24, South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
Billy Woodberry, filmmaker extraordinaire. Now, you're presently working on a film about the Angolan intellectual and activist Mario Andrade. When can we expect to see that film? Who was he? And what inspired you to work on a documentary about him?
I'm not sure of the order I will answer, but what I will say is when I was reading, and I was in study groups with other people, and we wanted to read. We wanted to read history. We wanted to read Marx. We wanted to read political economy. We wanted to understand something about philosophy and all those things. So we had reading groups. And Mario de Andrade, what happened? How did I come across Mario de Andrade? In the 1970s, and I think I still have this book in storage. It's rare, so I hope I find it. He wrote a text about culture and the national liberation, right? And it was published in English in Cuba in a volume collection. And I read it at the time that I was sort of learning about Brazil, and I was reading all the Brazilian novelists and things that I could, and also discovering politics of those people. And he talks about how important Brazil was as a source of inspiration and as an example of modernity for the people in what was then Portuguese Africa. And what they found in Jorge Amado, and all those Graciliano Ramos and all those things from Brazil that was helpful to them in thinking about their own situation and their efforts to create a modernity, a sense of modernity in poetry, literature, and art and that thing. And so I kept that idea. And then I learned more about him. I learned that he was the companion of this French Guadeloupean filmmaker, Sarah Maldor, that they were companions, that they had two daughters together, that they worked together on all of Sarah's films. I learned about Sarah's studying in Moscow, and Sarah made maybe one of the only important films about national liberation movements that was made at the time. And it was about Angola from 61 to 70 something. And it was called Sambizanga. That film is now in release, and you can find it in Criterion, and you can buy the DVD and all those things. But I saw that film in 1973 or something like that. And then when I came to this idea. I had this idea in 2014 when I thought I might. It was a simple question: what would I do? What could I do that would be useful, interesting, and engaging and challenging for me if I were to find myself in Portugal? And I started to think about it and look for things about him and about his activities and his life and that thing. And I started in 2014, then 2015, we started to develop the proposal, the idea, that kind of thing. And we spent all these years, I'm still learning things even as we're getting close to finishing the movie. But it's 5-6 years of research and raising funds and doing the work. But actually, we did most of the work. We did some work before, but we did a great deal of work between 21 and 22, December 21, till January 23, and we're getting close to finishing. And who was Mario de Andrade? Mario de Andrade was a young man he's born in Gulungo Alto, which is an important place north of Luanda, but it's in the countryside, and it's a famous coffee growing area during the colonial times. And he comes from that place, and it's a famous region, Malanje. It's a famous, in fact, one of the first actions that started the anti-colonial war, in a way, was a strike by cotton workers in Malanje, okay? The other famous one is an attack on a prison, and then there's the massacre of these people in northern Angola near Congo. But Malange is important because of this cotton strike. It's worth people knowing that. So in 1948, he leaves. He's educated, but he's educated. His father had been a former civil servant. His father had 13 children. He tried to educate all of them. Mario was brought to Luanda when he was 2 years old. And he had a brother who was 2 years older than him. His name was Joaquin Pedro de Andrade. And they have different mothers. But at 9 years old, Mario's father sends him to see his mother for the first time in 7 years. And then he asked him to bring his brother back from a nearby town to live with them in Luanda. They come back to Luanda. Mario is invited because he used to like the rituals of the Catholic Church. He was really impressed by that. And a priest from Saint Tomé was very kind to him and encouraging to him. And they invited Mario to come to the seminary to study at maybe 9, 10 years old. And he goes to his father and he says, they invited me to come to the cemetery. What do you think? The father says, if they take your brother, you can go. So he says, okay, they decide to accept Joaquin. It's an interesting story because Mario tells in the film why that was so, because the studies at the seminary was one way that Black African people of not wealthy people, could have an education for free, actually. So he had a lot of Black students in seminary. The other thing, it turns out he comes from a family that had been involved in the church for a long time. They have, and this Black priest, I learned a bit more of the prehistory of this modern period. These Black priests were notorious for defending the what they call indigenous people under the colonial system, and they were pain in the behind since the 19th century at least. So the story, what happens is Mario and Joaquin, they leave after they graduate and they do the exams. Mario comes to Lisbon to study philology and the classics and the School of Letters at the University of Lisbon. Joaquin and another friend, Nascimento, who became the Cardinal of Luanda, they go on to Rome to study at Gregorian University in Rome, and Joaquin eventually becomes a priest. Mario lost his faith at a certain point, and he didn't go that route. But Joaquin was maybe one of the most famous figures in all of Angola during the liberation movement. And he spent maybe 10 to 14 years in custody or in house arrest or something like that. And Mario was the first president of the MPLA, the organization that they just won an election. Its origin is in the group that Mario and others like Viriato de Cruz founded in Conakry in 1960. So, and then he becomes the president for 2 years, and then when Agostinho Neto escapes from prison, he relinquishes the presidency to Agostinho Neto, and he becomes the person in charge of foreign relations. And it's a long, complicated story of what happens with all of them, but that's the organization that announced, achieved, and eventually consolidated the independence of Angola. There's also associates, and they all worked here together in Lisbon. Amilcar Cabral is maybe one of the most important thinkers and leaders in Africa, and he and Mario were extremely close since they were introduced in 1948 until Amilcar died. 1973, Mario was the editor of 2 volumes of the writings and speeches of Amilcar Cabral. It's partly what we know of Amilcar Cabral is in part due to his efforts and work. what else can I say? And he suffered. He didn't go back to Angola really when he left in 1948. He couldn't legally go to Angola. He went back to Angola in 1971, and he went to the Eastern Front of the anti-colonial war near Zambia, and he pretty much carried out the first sociological and ethnographic study in the zone, in the Eastern Zone. In 1974, there's a three-way split in the MPLA, and Mario is a part of a group called Revolt Activa, or Active Revolt. There's another group from the East led by Daniel Chipinda, who was maybe the most important military leader in the MPLA. And then there's a group around President Agostinho Neto. They split, and the group of Agostinho Neto go to Alvor here in Portugal, where the Portuguese, after the Portuguese Revolution, they decide to grant the independence to the colonies. And at that meeting, what happened is the Portuguese said, we support and we give the independence of Angola, but we give it to the three organizations, UNITA, FNLA, led by Jolo Roberto, and the MPLA, led by Agostinho Neto. Mario, by this time, because they tried to democratize the leadership of the MPLA at the time, this active revolt was not, we take guns against the leadership. It was a movement that wanted to talk directly to the cadre and to the leadership and to the people at the base and all of that. And they wanted to come up with a form of leadership that was more democratic and collective, and that the others didn't necessarily share and agree to this. Then the Portuguese Revolution happened before they could really complete the process. And then it became of how do we get the independence and how do we defend the independence, okay? So then Mario is on the out. He goes then because Guinea-Bissau becomes independent. He was very close always. And he had been the head of the CONCP, which was the Congress of Organizations of Portuguese Anti-Colonial Movement. And he had been president of that. And he had been in charge of foreign relations for that. And he had always been close to all those movement people. And so Luis Cabral proposed and asked him to come to Guinea-Bissau to help them. And he became the Minister of Culture in Guinea-Bissau. And he did that job and did that work until 1980, when there's a coup d'etat by Nuno Vieira against the government of Luis Cabral. And that something happened there because the PAIGC is the Party of Independence, of African Independence for Guinea and Cape Verde. And they split the two at that point in 1980. Mario was outside the country and he didn't go back to Guinea-Bissau. And in the movie, you learn why he says that. I don't know if that's too much, but anyway, that's who he was. He was born in 1928 and he died in 1990. He became ill here in Lisbon. He had a kind of tropical problem, infection. They couldn't figure out what it was. They took him to London because in London, the tropical medicine, they were a bit more advanced. They hoped they could find it, but he died. And he went back to Angola he never had an Angolan passport. In 1980s, he asked for his passport and they refused, but he had a diplomatic passport from Cape Verde. After Guinea, he worked mostly with the people in Cape Verde, and he did some work at UNESCO. You know that multiple volume history of Africa? He worked on that project.
Now,
And then it was a real struggle to have his contributions and have him recognized within Angola. And it was only this João Lorenzo, the current president, who started the conversation by saying, I'm not the second president of the MPLA. I'm the fifth president of the MPLA. And then he names the others. So he names Mario.
So you've mentioned in passing a number of times, Billy Woodberry, filmmaker extraordinaire, that you are cited in Portugal. Finally, we've been reading numerous articles in the U.S. press about U.S. exiles in Portugal. We have a predominantly Black audience at Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles. What would you tell our audience if they are considering exile in Portugal?
Okay, most of the people who come to Portugal, they're not really exiled, and exile is too painful and complicated condition for me to claim exile. So I say it's for people, expatriate people who decide for one reason or another to live abroad. I think, yes, it's an attractive place, and it's being heavily promoted in the different presses and in the guides about tourism and this kind of thing. It's being promoted, and people are coming. Retirees, people who retire, who come. Another group that were coming for a time is they have a law, because if people can prove that they have ancestry or they have a connection to the Sephardic Jews that were expelled from Portugal at one historical period, that they can claim Portuguese citizenship. So you have some people who have traced their ancestry and that kind of thing, and they decide to come. You have some retirees and people who prefer a different environment, and they can afford to live abroad, and they move here. One attract also at one point they were offering something called a golden visa, and this would say that if you buy a property or you invest a certain amount in the country, that you can be accelerated toward getting. You get the visa, but you can get the passport also. That's part of the attraction. And the attraction is but they stopped that program because people were taking advantage of it, and they were not, actually doing or meeting the requirements or whatever. And then they stopped that. So now if people are willing to invest a certain amount, and they will move not into the main cities, Lisbon or Porto and that, if they want to move to some areas of the country, the countryside and different things, and contribute by restoring their place and doing that kind of thing, there's some advantage for doing that. Taxes you're relieved for 7 years or something. And this pleasant place, a beautiful place. The topography, the countride, cities. I would say that I'm a stranger here myself, so I wouldn't be the one to tell other people. I don't tell the people not to come, that kind of thing. But also it's a place of, what do you say? It has interesting connections to the story of the world, and for us in the New World, it has connections and some tragic aspects, but it's part of the story. And I would say that people, it's not heaven for the people who live here, for the people who come from the former colonies, or for the Portuguese people who struggle mightily against the conditions they face with dictatorship, and historically, right? Because it's an agricultural country, it was considered a poor country, this kind of thing. But it has a long and interesting history. It's part of the European Union. It's also a country with, I find it interesting that recently the Secretary General of the Communist Party of Portugal, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year or last year, and a party that lived in exile until 1974. It couldn't be, you were severely punished if you were a part of that activity. That on the occasion of the Secretary General of the party retiring and resigning and passing the leadership of the party to a younger man, on the television for 15 minutes or more, each of the political parties and people in parties in the parliament commented about his retirement. Okay? I don't know any other place that happens. And partly it happens because of their story and anti-fascist movement, but also their 1974 is 50 years next year, but that's not such a long time. And they have a presence, and they have, the groups and parties that disagree with them and all this kind of thing, but they have their place. And that's what I can say. And it's a country with whatever you think. It has a socialist prime minister and a socialist majority in the parliament. Okay, so it's not like, you get punished for saying socialism. You might get a serious debate from many people, and people who don't agree with that concept or idea. But I'm saying that's part of the story. I don't know that you get that part of the story in the ads about the wine and the hotels and those kind of things.
I see. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Billy Woodberry, member of the faculty at California School of the Arts in Valencia, filmmaker extraordinaire. His best-known film, Bless Their Little Hearts. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much. It's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Freedom Now, yes.
Right on.
Okay.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guest, Billy Woodberry. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon, our board up Wendell, and all those who made today's program possible. This program can be reheard for the next 60 days. Go to kpfk.org, audio archives, scroll to Freedom Now. You can email us your show ideas at freedomnow@kpfk.org. Please stay tuned for our sister Sumta coming up next with Spotlight Africa, addressing issues facing Mother Africa. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage, and until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.